The purpose of this short video is to give you an overview of Federalist 70. With this overview of Federalist 70, it will help you explain and analyze the role of the 21st century American president because of the way that our country sets up the single executive, which is explained by Hamilton in Federalist 70. Federalist 1 was a very challenging document to read through because it was written in the 1780s and it was written for an audience very different than we are today. Federalist 70 is no different. So I need you to remember the tips that I've given you for reading challenging documents of all sorts. First off, preview the document. What does it look like? Are there any clues that will help you decipher the basic structure of what's trying to be said? Once you look at the document, look for a thesis or main purpose. Create a brief outline if there's a structure that exists. If not, go ahead and start reading with a purpose in mind, with that thesis in mind, making highlights that support that thesis, making annotated notes of things that you're trying to simplify or paraphrase or summarize, and really importantly, highlight or circle or mark up things that you don't know. It's okay to not know things as you read, but it's not okay to leave those as questions when we come back to class. Different versions of Federalist 70, please read the first. So our first tip is to just preview the document and look for things that might stand out as clues as to how to read this better. So if you scroll through, you notice there's information about the origin of Federalist 70. And if you scroll through and you just look at what's there, you notice there aren't any bold-faced headings. There aren't any italicized words. There aren't any block quotes. There's really nothing that should draw your attention out. And please understand that there's again another copy of this that's slightly different. Please do not read that one. So if you scroll back to the top, this will set you up with, now there's nothing recognizable about the structure, but that's always something that you should start with first. The next thing you would want to do is start reading the document, but before you do, I think it's important that we take a look at the origin, purpose, value, and limitations for Federalist 70. If you notice, I'm not going to read to you word for word, but if you notice, all I'm telling you for the origin and what was all that was presented on the document that we just looked at. It was written by Alexander Hamilton, who we know is a Federalist. We know the date. We know who it was addressed to. We also know that this was published in a newspaper, so that would make it a primary source document. And it's important to note that this was written with a pseudonym. As you go, please make sure the notes that are displayed here on the screen get added into your personal notes for this document. After you scan the document looking for a basic structure, the next thing you should try to do is identify a main idea or a thesis for what was written. In most modern writing or in secondary sources, you can look at the abstract and the introduction and conclusion and pretty quickly identify the main thesis. However, in many primary source documents, it's a little harder. So when we get to the document, I will show you where the main thesis of Federalist 70 is, but for identifying the purpose here, we know that it was written to the people of New York in general to get them to ratify the Constitution, but specifically to get them to accept the idea of a single president or a single executive over what's called a plurality, or having more than one president. Since we've looked at the Federalist Papers before, in this case, this one's written by the same author, Alexander Hamilton's value and limitations for this document and for why we're reading are very similar to what we had before. So please look over the value and limitations, put those into your notes, and make sure you understand them as we get ready to roll into the document. What I would like to do now is to walk you through the main pieces of Federalist 70. I highly encourage that you pause the video and make highlights as you go, that you use your annotate toolbar here at the top, and in addition to the highlights, add your little notes so you know what's going on in the document. I'm going to get rid of that and put our highlighter back on. Let's move him over. There we go. So the first thing is, what's our main idea? The main idea is stated by Alexander Hamilton right here in the yellow, and I alternate colors just so it's easier for you to see things that I've highlighted. The main idea is simply that energy in the executive is a leading characteristic, or is a leading character in the definition of good government. Energy in the executive is important. Having a strong executive, having a strong president is very important for leading a united country. And then he goes into explaining in brief why this is essential for protection of the community, yada, yada, yada. But you want to make sure you look at those. This is how he's setting up why having a strong president is important. He dives into history with the next highlight here in green. Uh, Every man the least conversant in Roman history knows how the Republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man. Now, if you don't know something about Roman history, this is really where you need to take your annotate button and pull up a note in here and say, have Mr. Staub explain this to us. That's okay. Remember, as you read, if you see something that you aren't sure of, please make note of it. The second thing here in yellow is really almost a restatement of the thesis or the main topic, and he almost does it in a negative here. Over here on the left where it says energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government, he now says a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of government. So this yellow statement here is almost the opposite statement of what he said before. They're saying the same thing, but he states it in different ways. Remember, he's talking to audiences that have different views on what makes good government, so sometimes stating the negative presents a different way of explaining it to somebody. In green, I also pointed out that Hamilton says there are things here that are like ingredients for having a strong executive, for having a strong president, and he tries to go through and explain them, though he doesn't explain all 4 points clearly in Federalist 70, but through other Federalist papers he does. Moving on to page 313, he starts to make arguments for there are people in power who are celebrated who are honored for their strong beliefs and principles, who are honored for their belief in how government should be run and not for doing it for themselves. And then Hamilton spends a lot of time talking about how unity in a country can be destroyed or can be messed up by having more than one president or having more than one executive. Here in green, he gets into some of these ideas. Over here in yellow, he talks again about how the plurality of the executive is a bad idea. And again, these are kind of the topic sentences for these paragraphs. If you want to read more, and this paragraph over here is about Roman history, if you want to look into more about what he's saying, you can read those paragraphs in more detail. I'm just pointing out that he's using examples from history about where plurality or having two executives was a bad idea. On page 314, he starts making points about when any two people rule an organization, there's opportunity for conflict. Wherever two or more persons are engaged in any common enterprise or pursuit, there's always a danger of difference of opinion. There is always going to be conflict. So how can you have a strong, united country when that animosity or when those personal feelings get in the way? And I really like when Hamilton expresses that he understands the anti-federalist point of view. Later on page 314 over here on the right in yellow, men often oppose a thing merely because they have no idea or had no agency in planning it, or because it's been planned by those who they dislike. Just because the Federalists are planning this out doesn't mean the anti-federalists can't have part in it. And he goes on to explain how some of those people who didn't have a part in planning this will still be able to participate and agree with it. And then he goes back into, here in green on page 315, explaining why having multiple people or a legislature, kind of like the United States Congress, why having a legislature make decisions for the united country is a bad idea. The difference of opinion and the jarrings of parties in that department of government, though they may be sometimes obstructs salutary plans, yet often promote deliberations and circumspection and serve to check excess in majority. There's good reasons for having a lot of people do something, but it's really slow. It's a really slow process, and there are times where you need a strong executive to make quick decisions. Hamilton really starts to wrap up his main points for why energy in the executive is good by talking about what happens when you have more than two people, or two or more people run, in this case, run a country. What happens when something goes wrong? Who do you blame? What happens when somebody in government's corrupt? Who is responsible? And Hamilton makes the strong argument that one of the reasons why having one executive is important is because that one executive takes charge of everything. So if you read through the highlight in yellow here on the right, that's really what's going on. And he gets to that point several times. He tries to find times in the past where the plurality or having more than one executive takes away people's securities, takes away the ineffective or makes government ineffective. So some of my highlights here on 315 and 316 really help drive home the fact that more than one person running the government is a bad idea. And there's some examples here about in England um, that would that might not bring home. I'm just trying to point out some of the big ideas. If it hasn't been abundantly clear, Hamilton comes right out and says it on page 317. I can clearly concur in opinion that uh, the executive power is more easily confined when it is one. That is, that it is far more safe. There should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people, and in a word, that all multiplications of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. Again, summing up why he believes that one executive is important. I really like how Federalist 70 ends. That he spent time talking to people in different states, more specifically people of New York. But when he did, he found out that people admitted that in the state of New York in particular, having one person run the state, having one governor run the state, was better than trying to have multiple people do it. So he's trying to appeal here to people who think that states should have more control. And he's saying, you agree to this sort of setup at the state level. Why wouldn't you agree to this sort of setup for where you have one single executive for the entire United States? Now, what I'd like you to do is, if you weren't highlighting as we went along, go back and highlight Federalist 70. And what I'm going to give you time for as well is you really do need to read it to understand what Hamilton's arguments are. The purpose of going through some of these notes beforehand was to set up what Hamilton did and to give you an idea of what you'll be doing with the Federalist Papers that you'll be presenting to class to try to get across the main ideas.